Hello, America. I'm Brilyn Hollyhand, 16-year-old conservative commentator, founder, and editor-in-chief of the Truth Gazette. We're here in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, at one of the most iconic places in the South. We're in Bryant Denny Stadium with one of the most iconic people in conservative politics. Joining me now is the former Vice President of the United States, Mr. Vice President Mike Pence. Thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Brylan. It's great to be in Alabama and great to be with you.
Absolutely. I'm really looking forward to this. We've got a lot to talk about, so looking forward to it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, everybody knows you as the Vice President of the United States, but before that, you were the governor of the great state of Indiana. Before that, you were a U.S. Congressman. And before that, you were something even more interesting that I don't think most people know about you. Back in the 80s, you were a radio talk show host. You've even described yourself as, quote, Rush Limbaugh on decaf. So, how do you think hosting the Mike Pence show got you started in politics? And looking back, what do you think that 33-year-old man behind the microphone would think if he knew that one day he would be second in line for the most powerful job in the country?
Well, I know he would be humbled and grateful. But when I think of those years in talk radio, and that was really at the very beginning of talk radio. Rush Limbaugh had just emerged on the national stage, and my program was one of those shows that kind of followed his. I was on about 20 radio stations around Indiana, 3 hours a day, 6 days a week. But I always tell people that what I learned in my years of talk radio was not really what you might think. A lot of people think I learned how to talk, I learned how to communicate, but actually what I mostly learned was how to listen and to hear the common sense, the values, the good old-fashioned heartland wisdom that came over those phone lines every day. Frankly, laid a foundation in my life that when I would go to Congress, when I would serve as governor, and even as vice president, always gave me great confidence in the goodness and judgment of the American people.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, let's take another trip down memory lane to 2020. At the start of the pandemic, you were named the chair of the White House's COVID task force.
Mm-hmm.
There's been a lot of controversy recently about the origins of COVID-19.
Right.
For the first time, FBI Director Christopher Wray confirmed last month what we knew all along. He said, quote, "The FBI has for quite some time now assessed that the origins of the pandemic are most likely a potential lab incident in Wuhan." Just a few weeks ago, the House and Senate passed legislation to declassify government information on the origins of COVID. Biden signed that bill into law. As the original COVID task force chair, will you confirm today on the record that from the information that you've seen, you agree with the FBI director that the most likely origin of the coronavirus is from a lab leak?
Well, first, let me just say I'll always be proud of what the American people accomplished, particularly during those early days of the worst pandemic in 100 years, Brylan. I mean, in so many ways, because China had closed off the flow of information to the wider world and to our country, we didn't know what we didn't know. And in leading the White House Coronavirus Task Force, I was deeply inspired by the way the American people stepped forward, looking after neighbors and friends, doctors, nurses, first responders, but then the way we saw American businesses create supplies to make sure that our hospitals had what they needed, to make sure that there were grocery shelves that were filled around the country. It was a deeply inspiring time for me. But I must tell you, to answer your question, I always suspected that it came from the lab in Wuhan, and often brought that topic up at the White House Coronavirus Task Force. As I write in my book, So Help Me God, one of the members of our task force who led the CDC had a background in that area of science, and he always insisted it was from a lab, that it bore the indicia of that. And I never quite understood why Dr. Fauci and some others were always very insistent that it didn't come from a Chinese lab. But the truth is that China still hasn't come clean on the origins of COVID. They still haven't come clean about what they failed to do to warn the wider world. And I think the experience that we've had with COVID, the overall posture that China has taken on everything from human rights, trade abuses, continues to underscore the fact that I think our greatest strategic and economic challenge in the 21st century is communist China.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. While we're on the subject of 2020, let's talk about the election that year. Looking back, do you believe that there was fraud or irregularities in the 2020 election?
Well, I would say to some extent there's always fraud in elections. We have processes for discerning that. in this case, there was never evidence of widespread fraud that would have resulted in changing the outcome of the election. But that being said, there were irregularities in the election. There were roughly a half a dozen states that changed the rules late in the game in the name of COVID. And that's why one of the reasons why I thought the lawsuits that our campaign brought after the election in 2020 to essentially bring those before courts, and ultimately what I had hoped would have been a fulsome debate in the Congress of the United States on that fateful day, would have been important. Now look, courts ultimately upheld what the states did, and we have a system under the Constitution, Brilyn, where states certify elections. They can be challenged in courts. They're upheld by the courts, and that's how we move forward in our electoral process. But I couldn't be more pleased that states around the country have been taking decisive steps to restore public confidence in election integrity. States like Georgia and Texas and even here in Alabama have taken measurable steps to give people confidence in that one person, one vote. No more important principle in this representative democracy than that.
Absolutely, and I'll be voting for the first time in the 2024 election. I'll be turning 18 in June, so I'm excited to be casting my vote for the first time in a very secure election here in America. You brought up that fateful day. Let's talk about January 6th. A lot of people were critical of you that day. They say that you didn't do enough before certifying those election results. If you could do that day over again, would you have done anything differently?
Brilyn, I always believe that by God's grace we did our duty under the Constitution of the United States that day. The Constitution provides that the Vice President serves as the presiding officer over a joint session of Congress where the Electoral College votes that are certified by the states are, as the Constitution says, opened and counted. Nothing more, nothing less. The founders of this country, as your viewers who study history can confirm, were very concerned about consolidated power in the new country's capital. And so one of the things they did was they pushed elections out to the states and created this electoral college. And I believe that state control of elections is enormously important in the life of our nation. Now, there was a process where members of Congress could bring objections, and frankly, in the last 3 elections where a Republican president was elected, Democrats brought objections. There was nothing wrong with that occurring, but at the end of the day, I'd taken an oath to support and defend the Constitution, and the Bible says he keeps his oath even when it hurts. I know something about that. I believe we kept our oath that day. I believe we did our duty under the Constitution, but I must tell you, I'll always be proud of the record of the Trump-Pence administration, and I'll never stop fighting to get this country back on the track we had it on for those 4 years.
Thank you for all that you did in the administration. We'll talk about that here. But after leaving office, you wrote a book, you started a think tank, you're currently here traveling the country, speaking on college campuses. You're doing everything somebody about to announce a presidential run would do. So, Mr. Vice President, I have to ask you today, are you running for president in 2024?
Well, Brilyn, we're sure thinking about it. And more importantly, we've been praying about it as a family. I think there's 2 kinds of people in politics. There's people that are called and people that are driven. And if you read that book carefully, you'll find out I've been both. I've let my ambition get ahead of my values early on in my life. But the last 20 years in my service in the Congress and in Indiana and as Vice President, for Karen and me, it's always been about a calling. And so we're continuing to work through the details of that decision, but I promise to keep you posted. I'm very concerned about where the country is today. I'll share tonight with the gathering here at University of Alabama how it's just remarkable to me how in 2 short years President Biden and the Democrats have virtually reversed all the gains that we made for the American people. And whether it be the crisis at our border, record inflation, whether it be authoritarian regimes on the move around the world, you can almost tie each and every one of them to policies and decisions made by this administration that either initiated them or emboldened the actions around the world. And so I think it's a time for all of us, for young people like you, Brilyn, and for people with hair my color, to make sure that we're all doing everything we need to do to get this country turned around, and I know we will. Yes,
sir. So you're sure you don't want to make any announcements here today?
Not today.
Okay. Well, we'll be looking forward to that soon. Speaking of some upcoming announcements, Let me ask you this. Ron DeSantis, he's rumored to announce his campaign for president around May or June. Does that timeline sound like something that you would consider for the announcement of whether or not you're running?
I do think, given the nature of our primaries, that should we make an announcement, I expect people will know by summertime what the Pence's intentions are.
Okay.
And but I got to tell you, for a small town boy who grew up with a cornfield in my backyard, it's always been very humbling for me to just be asked.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And but somebody asked me many years ago, Brylan, they said, you ever think about being president of the United States? And I said, well, no more, no less than any other kid that grew up in a small town in rural Indiana. That's kind of what it is to be an American. You can dream big dreams, right? So we'll keep thinking, we'll keep praying, and
Sure.
As I said, I'll keep you posted.
Sure, it should be an eventful summer, indeed, and you're definitely living out the American dream already. I know you're not going to confirm anything today on whether or not you're running, but you have confirmed you're considering a run at least.
Mm-hmm.
So let me ask you this: in your mind, who is a Mike Pence voter? Is it a Reagan Republican? Is it some an evangelical conservative tired of the drama of politics? Is it a supporter you hope to shave off of your former boss's base? Who is a Mike Pence voter?
Well, I think that'd be up to every voter to decide whether or not. People that supported us when I ran for Congress 6 times successfully, and people that supported me when I ran for governor, and people that supported us when I was elected vice president. I hope they see in us a happy warrior, someone that cherishes my Christian values, unapologetically conservative, but also believes in the people of this country. I truly do believe the challenge that we face today, Brylan, is we just got to have government as good as our people again, because the people of this country, as you'll find in the many years that lie ahead in your career, you're going to find this is a nation of great people, caring, generous, freedom-loving, faith-filled, innovative, creative, greatest people on earth. And I know someday soon we'll have government again worthy of our people.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We brought up your former boss. He's already announced his run for president. Mm-hmm. Would you endorse Donald Trump if he's a GOP nominee?
Well, there may be somebody I'd be more supportive of in that process. But look, the former president has every right to seek election to the White House once again. And I expect there'll be competition in the field, and we may just be a part of it.
Sure. Well, wrapping up here, there's been some short lists reported in the press that President Trump may be considering him as his VP nominee. There's also been some reporting that he's considering announcing his running mate fairly early in the process here. Do you have any advice for Trump's running mates, whoever he or she might be?
Well, I must tell you, when the phone rang in 2016 and Donald Trump asked me to join the ticket, I said yes in a heartbeat. I believed that our country was in a lot of trouble.
Yes.
And we joined the ticket and never looked back. And I couldn't be more proud of the record that we built together. And for me, anybody ever making that kind of decision would do well simply to reflect not so much on the person as on the agenda. And I couldn't be more proud of the fact that under the Trump-Pence administration, our commitment to rebuild the military, revive the economy, unleash American energy, and appoint conservatives to our courts at every level, including 3 of the justices that gave us a new beginning for the right to life. Those were all promises made, and as we always used to say, promises kept. And anyone vying for office at every level, I think, ought to always be looking for people whose yes is yes, whose no is no. Identify those issues and those values, align yourself with those, and you'll find your way forward.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for your time. Closing out here today, I want to ask you a personal question about your faith. You're known for your strong Christian faith. Some say it's one of the reasons you were chosen to be President Trump's running mate, to help win over the Christian voters back in 2016. Looking back on your 4 years in the White House as the second most powerful person in the country, how did your faith help get you where you are today?
Well, the most important decision I ever made was in 1978 as a freshman in college when I accepted Jesus Christ as my personal Lord and Savior. Learned lessons along the way. Still consider myself a growing Christian that has a lot to learn. But during my years in the White House, same as when I was governor and when I was in the Congress of the United States, that personal relationship with God that came through my Christian faith sustained me and my wife and our family every day. We try and pray a bit every day. We try and open His Word and be guided by the timeless wisdom and truth that we find there. But I also truly do believe that in all of our times in service, it also shaped the way I always tried to deal with people. You know, I like to say I'm a conservative, but I'm not in bad mood about it. I've always tried to, at least in the last 20 years in politics, I've tried to treat others the way I want to be treated, and I hope it helped me be able to play an effective role. I know the president had a slightly different style than me on most days, but I hope that my ability to reach across the political spectrum because of years of trying to practice civility in politics made it more possible for me to be able to be a constructive force to move the legislation that secured our border, revived our economy, unleashed energy, saw those conservatives on our courts. And as the father of a Marine and father-in-law of a naval aviator, we made the largest investment in our national defense in a generation. And but getting all those things done, I hope also the way my faith informed me about dealing with others made it more possible for me to be able to help those policies along. And but at the end of the day, it was a privilege for me to be a small part of it. And every single day, my faith in the Lord sustained us in our work.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Well, Mr. Vice President, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I greatly appreciate it. Again, welcome to Sweet Home, Alabama. We're very honored to have you here on campus, and looking forward to hearing your speech tonight. So thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you, Brilyn. Congratulations on
Thank
all
you.
your youthful success. I'm very impressed.
Really appreciate it. Really appreciate it. And for more interviews, you can go to thetruthgazette.com or follow me, Brilyn Hollyhand, on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and we'll be following the Vice President this summer with hopefully some more announcements.